The impossible conversation. In a post-truth world, we need a safe place to have conversations about things that really matter. In the business-as-usual world, we just can't talk about the insanity that's now called normal. And we don't talk about our core disconnection from the web of life. The impossible conversation, where we can come together to fully feel what we're going through and discern the sober reality of the world around us. The impossible conversation, where we can set our sights on fully reconnecting with our deeper, wiser selves, others, and Earth. The impossible conversation, where thought and activist leaders can explore new ways of being in the face of our global predicaments. The impossible conversation. Welcome to this safe circle. In this episode of the Impossible Conversation podcast, we're back with Hambone Littletail, the host of HumptyDumptyTribe, a very successful channel on YouTube. Very much appreciate Hambone's attention, and he reads the Impossible Conversation better than I could. So listen in, it's a great show, and thanks again to Hambone for his care and great reading.
Hi guys, it is an unbelievably spectacularly gorgeous day here in the end times, or should I say here at the end of business as usual, here on this gorgeous day in paradise in Mendocino County. Yes, Mendocino County, my favorite county, for various reasons, on this beautiful sunny day. And it is Sunday, July 23rd, 2017. So this is your old doomsday preacher, Hambone, and his little dog, bringing you my doomsday sermon, where I read from my latest favorite Bible of the Apocalypse. And not so sure that this is a Bible of the Apocalypse, because I'm only halfway through this, but certainly the first half of this book qualifies as a Bible of the Apocalypse. We will see what the second half holds. And this is the brand new book, the highly recommended brand new book from one of our own tribes members, right here on HumptyDumptyTribe. My buddy Dean Walker has just come out with his book, The Impossible Conversation, Choosing Reconnection and Resilience at the End of Business as Usual. And I hope I'm going to be able to interview Dean in a couple of days, and we will talk a lot more about the second half of the book, about what depressed collapsitarians are supposed to do with their lives once they understand that we are so fucked. But since I am a doomsday preacher giving a doomsday sermon, we're going to check in with from the first half of the book, specifically chapter 4, and I could just pick any chapter. We're going to read chapter 4. It would have been nice if I had marked chapter 4 where it begins. Oops, that's already chapter 6. The first 3 chapters of this book are pretty much just take 7 years of my climate change meltdown roundup rants and combine them, and you will take care of the first 3 chapters. But number 4 is going to be a reflection, I would say, of my Monday rants, my economic meltdown roundup rants, where I look at various ways the global industrial economy, otherwise known as what I call the New World Order, is taking down a planet. And I guess this chicken is just going to join me in crowing that the sky is falling. Yes, Chicken Little, we understand the sky is falling. Yes, we get it. Anyway, I think it's fine to have Chicken Little as the background from Chapter 4. What did corporations and governments know, and when? And we'll just read, let's read, man, there's a lot of really good quotes in here, but I've already done the quotes of the week. So we're just going to read, we're going to skip all of these excellent quotes and get to Dean's own writing. Whoa! So take it away, Dean. Preacher Dean. We now have a substantial foundation of understanding, from the first 3 chapters, that even the most conservative projections show us barreling ahead toward an unlivable planet by 2100. The abrupt climate change projections, meaning the Guy McPherson crowd, have us there by mid-century or sooner. We also have a huge number of life-critical metrics, the extinction projections in the previous chapter, to add to the measurements of CO2 in our atmosphere. These combined metrics indicate that the lifestyle we lead, particularly in the developed world, are having a devastating impact on other species, on our shared habitat, on the biosphere we call home. I finished up the last chapter asking, how did we get ourselves to this brink, and pondering how have I been complicit in this? Yes. While these are strong questions for us all to ponder, I'm going to hold off on the exploration of our personal culpability in this predicament until later chapters. I would like to share with you some of the most stunning pieces of our collective story I have found in the course of my research. These historical elements add substance and gravitas to the notion that senior corporate executives across multiple industries and government leaders at the highest levels have known for decades with great precision that our business as usual burning of fossil fuels would create an unlivable planet by the middle of the 21st century. There you go. And at this point in my own process, I did my best to stay focused on the research at hand and not let myself be overwhelmed by the scale of this cynical, deeply destructive system. It is here I will share with you some of the significant data I found regarding U.S. government complicity in avoidance and cover-up of climate change data from the Baby Bush administration. But as you will see, my stumbling into this article was almost trivial when compared with the 2016 disclosure of oil companies' alleged fraud, duplicity, and distortion of data. With this exploration of some of the most prominent large-scale structures and influences and how they affect our world, let's start with the global agency that has been tasked with articulating and measuring the entire issue we have come to call climate change. And this, of course, would be our old buddies at the United Nations. And, of course, which I label the United Nations the single biggest bunch of planet eaters completely in the pockets of the fossil fuel companies and other global corporations in the history of mankind. This is the global agency, the fox guarding the henhouse that he's referring to. Getting back to Dean. The UN's Association of Climate Scientists, who establish for us all the jargon, metrics, and standards which we talk about climate change, is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This group of scientists are volunteers who focus on vetting any and all current research that is being done in the climate science. The IPCC has been called correctly, I mean that was my word, correctly, one of the most conservative scientific bodies on the planet. On a regular basis, the IPCC issues public reports, more or less a state of the climate report, to keep the public, the business world, and government agencies up to speed with our collective climate situation. When we have global conferences like COP21, blah, 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 it is the IPCC that provides all the statistics, projections, data, and jargon that are needed to have the public understand what is going on with our global climate, and to have the policymakers and decision makers draft their policies using the best possible data and context.
Bullshit detected. Take precautions.
So, in the name of a much shortened book, with fewer of those pesky details and numbers, I will list a few compelling facts about the IPCC and the other agencies that influence them. And leading into that, I will read this quote from Professor Kevin Anderson, climatologist Kevin Anderson. I've had rants about Kevin before. This is Kevin Anderson's summation of the IPCC. Climate scientists are self-censoring, climate scientists in the IPCC are self-censoring their own findings. We dare not report findings that in any way indicate the need to change our global model of perpetual growth. To do so threatens both our perceived credibility and future funding of research. We all, meaning all climatologists, know the situation is much more severe. It, meaning the IPCC and all of their horseshit reports, is a collective facade. And that pretty much sums up the IPCC and the UN. It is, they're not going to dare. The United Nations, the single biggest promoter in the history of humanity of the global model of perpetual growth, is absolutely not going to let the IPCC threaten that model. Is there anybody left on HumptyDumptyTribe not understanding this? that these goddamn limp dick mainstream environmentalists cheering on this goddamn unadulterated horseshit COP21 Paris Agreement. It's a fucking joke. Kevin Anderson knows it. Dean knows it. I know it. Sancho Panza knows it. And Al Gore knows it goddamn well. Anyway, getting back to Dean. So this is just Dean summing up what his research has taught him about the IPCC and the UN. At COP21, the first truly global agreement to limit CO2 emissions was formed. The agreement was to reduce global emissions enough to avoid a 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise. An additional search target was detailed, to 1.5 degrees. Point number 2, all of the COP21 Paris agreements are voluntary in nature. There is no enforcement structure in place for non-compliance by any country. In order to accomplish these goals, a global carbon budget was estimated. This articulated how much CO2 could be emitted over the coming years and still keep our temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius.
Oh, come on now, that ain't even bullshit. That's horseshit.
Okay, next. Every word of the IPCC's public reports or, quote, summaries for policymakers is edited and filtered by delegates from all the participating governments and numerous corporate representatives. And right there, this is the reason that I continually say the reason that all of these global fossil fuel corporations are in full support of the Paris Climate Agreement is because they wrote it. All right, let's see. Next, any climate scientist who is accused of going too far with his or her own interpretation of the data or being an alarmist can and will be vilified and threatened by any number of different propaganda sources. The U.S. is by far the guiltiest of this vilification of climate scientists. Michael Mann, James Hansen, Jason Box, to name but a few. Okay, next. The IPCC has not included any of the positive feedback loops that are shown to accelerate and intensify abrupt climate change advancement. And this, of course, includes methane. The methane bomb is nowhere taken into account in these IPCC projections. Completely ignored. All the IPCC looks at is CO2 emissions, which I don't think Dean talks about in here, which of course are based entirely on self-reporting from these lying sacks of shit government leaders all over the planet, of course being led by China. Anyway, back to Dean. The IPCC has been prohibited from including any tracking of the global airline industry, the global shipping industry, or the U.S. military, the world's largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels, in any of its calculations regarding CO2 emissions and the COP21 Paris Accord. So even with the emissions, the CO2 emissions, does not include the single biggest emitter of CO2 emissions on the planet. Well, probably the top three: the U.S. military, the global shipping industry, and the airline industry. This is, you know, my no shit Sherlock button. I would be burning the batteries out of it if I had it here. And finally, when calculated at the end of COP21, all of the reduction targets by all of the countries were clearly not sufficient to avoid 2 degrees Celsius. Further projections of business as usual emissions yielded IPCC projections of between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And remember, this is all this is the bullshit CO2 emissions, not counting the 3 biggest emitters on the planet, and not counting methane and, you know, everything else. The bottom line, if you don't understand what Kevin is saying here, is that this fucking Paris Climate Accord is an absolute joke. Okay. Then he breaks down this bullshit global CO2 emissions budget, and he quotes a lot of he quotes he breaks down, he turns this over to Bill McKibben. So let's listen to Bill McKibben summarizing our global CO2 emissions budget. Okay. Point number one, according to Bill, and I agree with Guy McPherson that Bill McKibben is being way too conservative. Okay, take it away, Bill. Number one, we must reduce our CO2 emissions by 80 to 90% by 2050. Of course, I would say we needed to reduce our CO2 emissions by 100% by 1950 would be, okay. To have a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees, we must stay below an emissions cap of 565 gigatons of CO2, and we globally currently emit about 30 gigatons a year. This is from, we've talked about the Do the Math tour. The bottom line is this. Is the estimate of the known reserves, the fossil fuel resources located but still in the ground. Fossil fuel companies are estimated to own enough reserve supply. This is not shit they're going, the new stuff they're looking for. The stuff they already know about is 5 times the amount of our global CO2 budget. So, this is why whenever I get into this peak oil debate, I say we're obviously going to burn this planet to toast before we run out of oil. The shit we already know about is 5 times, is going to burn this planet down 5 times over. Addition, this is back to Dean. Additionally, I can tend to be over-encouraged by the news that renewables are being installed at a rapidly increasing rate. He quotes another article stating that even with more than 1 million solar power installations in the U.S., those installations only represent 1% of U.S. power consumption. Yep. I will not take the time here to detail the immense expense of a 100-fold increase of solar installations. Let's just say it is astronomical. Then he quotes at length from an open letter to world leaders at the Paris Climate Conference, where academics from around the world articulating what they see as the more sobering version of our climate situation. This is quoting this letter. Let's read a little bit of it. It looks unlikely that the international community will mandate even the greenhouse gas reductions necessary to give us a 2/3 chance of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. At the moment, even if countries meet their current non-binding pledges to reduce their carbon emissions, we will still be on course to reach 3 degrees by the end of this century. This is profoundly shocking, given that any sacrifice involved in making those reductions is overshadowed by the catastrophes we are likely to face if we do not. More extinction of species and loss of ecosystems, increasing vulnerability to storm surges, more heat waves, more intense precipitation, more climate-related deaths. I think we get it. And this is why on the next chapter, as I read a couple of days ago, quoting Rex Tillerson, that the right of humans to have the convenience of fossil fuels outweighs the death of a planet. That it is more important that humans enjoy fossil fuels than it is that they enjoy a planet where humans can survive. Okay. And then, of course, he compares the IPCC projections to the abrupt climate change advocate. So IPCC is looking at 3 to 5 degrees C by 2100, while the abrupt climate change advocates speak of 3 to 10 degrees C between 2026 and 2050. Where the IPCC offers a projection of 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100, the anthropogenic climate disruption advocates such as James Hansen predict as much as 1 meter of sea level rise every 20 years for the foreseeable future. And he has a long quote from James Hansen talking about this. Then he talks about the just over the top ice melt in both of the polar regions. And then, of course, looking at the glaciers, scientists are now estimating that between 70 and 99% of the world's glaciers will be completely gone by 2100. Oh, Jesus. So this is as Dean was figuring all of this out for himself. I was plagued by the unshakable knowledge that the IPCC is a collection of world-class climate scientists doing their best to provide the strongest data possible to inform the public and global policymakers. But they are under the constant scrutiny and pressure of corporate and corporate-owned government representatives who want nothing more than the complete suppression or manipulation of accurate climate data. And of course, Donald Trump just bringing this to a new height. With the combination of the ongoing threatening and vilification of climate scientists, an intricately woven fog of media ineptitude, climate denial and doubt, there appears to be a seamless membrane that keeps us from having the kind of holy shit moment described by climatologist Eric Rignot. And of course, the title of yesterday's climate change roundup rant was James Hansen talking about our shit hits the fan moment. Yes. And then he breaks down all of this stuff about Exxon. Last year, right when he was ready to take the book to press, all of this big story about Exxon covering up all of the data from their own scientists saying that we are fucked. That, of course, Rex Tillerson leading the pack to bury this data from Exxon. And right in the middle of that story, Donald Trump appointing the single biggest planet eater on the planet to be our U.S. Secretary of State. And you wonder why we are so fucked. And quoting Rex Tillerson, again, now I've mentioned this quote before. I agree 100% with Rex Tillerson. Quote, global demand for energy will grow 25% in the next 25 years, and countries, meaning that make up the UN, will guzzle oil 5 times the size of Saudi Arabia's reserves. And you can be pissed off about that. This is a statement of no shit Sherlock fact by our esteemed Secretary of State. And then he dives into this absolutely horseshit idea of this this carbon capture technology, sucking the CO2 out of the air. The conclusion of that logic string is that when this carbon capture technology is in place and fully functional, we will all be able to just go back to business as usual and stop all of this pesky chatter about reducing our CO2 emissions and the dangers of climate change. Let's see. Wow. Well, guys, I don't know where I am. I think we understand. You know, I could just continue on with this excellent with Brother Dean, just spelling this out. Let's see. Okay. What are you asserting, Dean? I like the way Dean does this. Occasionally I am asserting here. I am asserting here that the core data and projections that make up what I like to call the sober data of abrupt climate change has been available to and known by every high-level corporate executive and every high-level government official around the world since at least the 1980s. I am asserting that the evolution of the climate change denier propaganda campaign has been intricately and richly choreographed by big money interests and the government officials who are and long have been in the pockets of those interests. And then he looks in just to a few examples of the marriage between the fossil fuel corporations and people in the highest level of government. This is, I could break all this down and spend an hour on here, but you need to just go get this book yourself if you don't get this. But of course, the appointment of Exxon's CEO by Donald Trump to be our Secretary of State is just the absolute pinnacle of what they're talking about here. Let's see, then he talks about then he brings Russia and this and about the Rex Tillerson love affair between Rex Tillerson and Vladimir Putin, obviously. There you go. The bottom line, the Trump administration has formed an aligned front to not only officially deny climate change, but to repeal any promises or agreements from COP21 and eliminate the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for all practical purposes. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, so in the end, Exxon and other majors predict very prosperous years ahead for the fossil fuel industry. They now have unrestricted access and editorial control over the IPCC reporting process and unhindered access to and control over the entire U.S. government. They appear to have complete control of the public discourse about all matters of climate environment, social justice, environmental justice, national and international policy making regarding further extraction of fossil fuels in the Arctic and elsewhere around the world. Pretty sweet deal, huh? With this new administration at the helm and a Republican Senate, House, and Supreme Court right behind them, it is hard to imagine a worse nightmare for the health and well-being of all Earth systems and, of course, humanity. There you go. So anyway, that's chapter 4 from The Impossible Conversation by Dean Walker. And again, I haven't made it to the second half of the book, where I guess Dean talks about what we as individuals can do with this information. But hopefully I'll be interviewing Brother Dean in the next couple of days, and we'll talk to him directly about exactly what he thinks we're going to do about this. But I highly recommend The Impossible Conversation, Choosing Reconnection and Resilience at the End of Business as Usual. And just go on Amazon.com. Go on Amazon.com and you can pick up this book, and we'll talk to Dean about how maybe you can join Dean and Carolyn Baker and Hambone Littletail and Sancho Panza in Ashland, Oregon in mid-September to continue the impossible conversation. But I'm going to wrap up this impossible conversation because the little dog says, "Pop, would you wrap it up so we can go to the beach?" So we're off to the beach on this gorgeous day in the end times while we still can. Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Impossible Conversation podcast, produced by Dean Walker and Living Resilience. Music provided today by Port Blue, Into the Sea. To be considered as a guest on the Impossible Conversation podcast, or to set up coaching, speaking arrangements, workshops, online resilience education, and resilience bridge trainings, contact us at livingresilience.earth or impossibleconversation.net, safecircle@gmail.com, or find us on Twitter @safecircle.